In spring 2015, my college-going son and I embarked on a journey across the 1914 to 1918 Western Front, starting from the British battlegrounds in Flanders, passing through the French territories in Champagne and Lorraine, and culminating at the American graveyards and markers, locations like Château, Thierry, Belleau Wood, St. Quentin, and the Argonne. The closer we got to the American zones, the sparser the tourists became. While the Menin Gate at Ypres, a grand tribute to Britain's fallen, was swarming with hundreds of visitors, the vast Meuse, Argonne Cemetery, Europe's largest American military graveyard, was eerily quiet with just us. One individual on Twitter provided an insightful take on why World War I doesn't resonate strongly with Americans. They quipped, "Americans have a penchant for the sequel, more formidable foes, grander spectacles." There's truth to that. Yet, even if this particular war doesn't loom large in the collective American psyche, its repercussions undoubtedly mold American society. In the US, World War I is an uncommon instance, with another being George W. Bush's Iraq War, where the conflict became more despised post-event than during its progression. The staggering tolls on human lives and economy from the First World War, the shattered expectations of societal redemption through the war, the inability to secure a lasting peace, the subsequent Great Depression which questioned the liberal world structure many Americans thought they were fighting for, the democratic breakdown in numerous European nations, and the ominous approach towards another global conflict, all these post-war events seem to scorn every principle and aspiration that Americans believed they were fighting for in April 1917. So, who was to be held accountable? This became a central issue during the political discussions between the wars. The backlash faced by President Woodrow Wilson for his wartime decisions would delay America's reaction to the ascent of Adolf Hitler, and its effects would ripple through foreign policy debates into contemporary times. The word Wilsonian remains a term of pride and derision in American foreign policy discussions. During the years between the wars, blame for America's participation in the now detested First World War was variously attributed to the cunning strategies of British intelligence, the financial strategies of Morgan Bank, the profit motives of the American weapons sector, or even the aggressive nature of capitalism. Between 1934 and 1936, headlines highlighted a congressional committee led by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota that delved into the practices of banks, weapon manufacturers, and other alleged merchants of death. These enterprises, driven by avarice, were said to have deceitfully led the unsuspecting American populace down the road to war, which was also the title of a condemning bestseller of that era. The dilemma the US faced in 1917 echoes the challenges America encountered in 1941, post-World War II, and now with China's ascent, who determines the global order? Those once dubbed merchants of death underwent a rebranding when President Franklin Roosevelt rechristened America's defense industries as the arsenal of democracy. Nevertheless, the skepticism about war's origins persisted. "He deceived us into war," was Claire Booth Luce's sharp critique of Roosevelt's 1939-41 actions, but many who echoed her sentiment overlooked her admission of the war's inevitability, because he lacked the bravery to lead us into it. The suspicions surrounding the First World War were overshadowed by the Pearl Harbor attack. Journalist Frederick Lewis Allen, who witnessed both World Wars, noted how America entered the 1941 conflict with neither fervor nor opposition. Today, only a fringe minority debates the essentiality of confronting Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Yet, as the US grappled with the prolonged Cold War against the Soviet Union, the non-interventionist sentiments of the interwar period occasionally resurfaced. According to this view, wars and conflicts were unwarranted, thrust upon an otherwise peaceful US by vested interest groups. To grasp why the US engaged in 1917, one should ponder the potential outcome had America abstained. Without the bolstering presence of US support both on land and at sea, it's hard to see how the Allies might have triumphed over a Germany that had already ousted a tumultuous Russia from the war. During 1917 summer, the Western Allies had depleted their financial standing in US markets. Without direct US government support, they wouldn't have managed more offensives in the West. These drained allies would have been forced to discuss terms with Central Power units controlling vast areas in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, a portion of Italy, most of Belgium, and a large section of northeast France. Even if Germany offered trade-offs in the West to hold on to the East, Germany under the Kaiser would have emerged as Europe's predominant force. This would leave the US, post such a truce, facing a scenario similar to 1946, a Europe bisected between East and West, with the weakened West relying on the US for defense. The East, however, would be led by an authoritarian government that viewed the democratic Anglo-American West as more than a geopolitical foe, but an ideological menace. But contrasting 1946, when division occurred at the Elbe, this hypothetical 1919 demarcation might have occurred at the Rhine, maybe even the Scheldt or the Meuse. This would place the epicenter of European industry in the East. Instead of the more underdeveloped Russia reigning in Eastern Europe, it would be Europe's most forward-looking nation, Germany. In essence, the US would have prematurely entered the Cold War phase, possibly even another direct conflict, aided by weaker allies against a mightier, wealthier adversary, potentially the first to achieve the atomic bomb and long-range missiles. While some might jestingly remark about a Europe led by Germany as a current reality, it's an oversimplification. Present-day Germany's leadership in Europe is through consensus, not force. It acts as a loyal member and chief contributor within the broader Western alliance, rather than opposing it. Present Germany is a stabilizing force, contrary to the unpredictable entity it was from the 1860s to the 1940s. Modern Europe ardently pursues the ideal conveyed by Wilson in his impactful piece, Without Victory address on January 22, 1917, a lasting peace can only stem from equals. Such a peace must be rooted in equal rights, existing among large and small nations, the powerful and the weak alike. More profoundly, lasting peace necessitates the acceptance that governments derive their rightful powers from the people's consent. No genuine peace exists when populations are traded between sovereignties as mere assets. Such a peace was certainly not what was proposed by the Kaiserreiche during 1917 and 1918. Similar to George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, I reflect on these hypothetical scenarios to gain deeper insight into actual events. The pivotal query facing the US in 1917 mirrors the dilemmas faced in 1941, post-World War II, and presently as China ascends, who will dictate global order? Will it be the United States with its democratic ideals, or contenders driven by potent authoritarian ideologies? Common recollection often differentiates sharply between World War II and the duo of World War I and the Cold War. This popular perspective stresses the moral undertones of World War II, sidelining its strategic goals. However, this viewpoint isn't immune to critiques. A war against totalitarian regimes waged alongside Stalin. A freedom fight that left half of Europe under communist rule. A campaign against mass slaughter culminating in atomic bombings on 2 Japanese cities? What of the famine in Bengal? The detainment of Japanese Americans? The racial divide in the US military? The moral narrative of World War II is usually anchored on the Jewish Holocaust, a catastrophe the Allied leaders showed limited concern for at the time. Many wish the Allies had combated the Holocaust head-on, but they didn't. Their battle against Hitler would have been just as vigorous even without his focus on Jews. Americans sometimes view their nation as unlike any other, either as a beacon of purity and morality or as a deeply flawed entity. If it isn't fighting to put an end to war, a phrase erroneously linked to Wilson, then it's perceived as battling for financial moguls and armament manufacturers. But one genuine sentiment from Wilson does encapsulate the crux of the matter in 1917, and indeed ever since. In his war declaration request to Congress against Germany on April 2, Wilson emphasized the need to ensure the world is safe for democracy. Not democratic, but a sanctuary for democracy. Wilson's objective wasn't to force democracy upon Imperial Germany but to shield democracy from its threats. The World War I wasn't initiated as a battle between democratic values and autocracy. In August 1914, Britain wasn't a fully fledged democracy. Neither was Tsarist Russia. The same applies to Japan, Italy, and Romania. All were part of the Entente but were governed by just a minority of their populations. Even in France, the most democratic among the early Allies, the elected officials weren't in complete command of the state. Furthermore, despite being the most democratic, the Third Republic oversaw an expansive colonial empire and denied suffrage to women. Yet, when Wilson voiced his stance on making the world safe for democracy, the complexion of the war had evolved. Post-war, Britain transformed into a nation with universal suffrage for all men, and soon, for women as well. Russia experienced a revolution that culminated in the dethroning of the Tsar. Several of Europe's neutral nations, like Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden, embraced democracy during or post the war. Countries that achieved independence post-war, such as the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, Finland, and Poland, initially took the path of democracy. British dominions like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, already practicing universal male suffrage, post-war, further solidified their autonomy. Even Italy and Japan dabbled, albeit for a short span, with the principles of liberal democracy in the early 1920s. Furthermore, the newly republican China declared its stance against Germany in August 1917. The American tendency to self-criticize is as pronounced as its self-affirmation, both shaped by misconceptions. America's inherent power influences global dynamics, even when dormant. As the conflict progressed, the Central Powers drifted away from democratic governance. Pre-1914, both Germany and the Habsburg Empire boasted elected national assemblies. However, these assemblies had minimal sway over government actions, and their influence dwindled during the war. When the Central Powers established new administrations, notably in Ukraine, they favored authoritarian or militaristic structures. Most infamously, German officials financially supported an exiled Vladimir Lenin and later facilitated his return, leading to the demise of Russia's short-lived democratic experiment in 1917. If the Western Allies had suffered defeat in the First World War, European democracy would have faced the challenge that American democracy overcame during the Civil War, enduring amidst the rivalry between nations and systems. In 1917, the United States, while a democracy, was far from perfect. Specifically, African Americans faced systematic oppression and regularized brutality, akin to the conditions German Jews experienced in the early years under Hitler. Racist ideologies permeated not just the rural, less educated South, but also the esteemed universities, the highest echelons of federal administration, and academic societies. While these ideologies faced opposition, their eventual dismissal was not a given. Victory often garners admiration. In 1940, when democracy seemed on the back foot, and Mauro Lindbergh praised German fascism as the tide of the future. If Imperial Germany had triumphed in 1918, many might have proclaimed that Otto von Bismarck's doctrine of iron and blood had definitively eclipsed Abraham Lincoln's ideal of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. The quintessential American aspiration is to vanquish formidable foes, ensuring a future unburdened by external global concerns. When this dream is dashed, when lasting peace and undeniable security seem elusive, Americans often resort to introspection, pondering if their nation's actions incited global animosity. This tendency to self-criticize is as intrinsically American as the nation's penchant for self-affirmation, both rooted in misconceptions. America's actions in the past century stem not from its inherent goodness or wickedness but from its vast wealth, prominence, and strength. Even when passive, America's might influences global dynamics. Any ambitious power with non-democratic intentions instinctively views the US as a formidable barrier to its goals. This was the sentiment of Germany in 1917 and mirrors the apprehensions of countries like Iran today. Germany's military leaders in the time of the Kaiser believed that their aspirations clashed with the overbearing might of the US. For years, Americans hoped for a peaceful coexistence, but their rivals saw the inherent conflict more lucidly, compelling action. This pattern has repeated throughout the past century and continues to resonate today. As long as America maintains its dominant position, a stature it's held since 1917. The visionary American thinkers of a century past, albeit not always with perfect foresight, discerned the pivotal challenges of 1917. They envisioned a world of promise and also recognized the adversities of failing to achieve it. Their endeavors faced numerous setbacks post-1918, casting a shadow over their entire mission. But with the clarity of hindsight, contemporary observers can appreciate the monumental challenges these pioneers grappled with, devoid of past experiences or precedents to guide them. Today, concerns linger about the stability of democratic societies in the face of assertive, non-democratic forces. American intentions remain complex and multifaceted, as is the nature of human intent. By grasping the nuances of history, Americans can move past the oversimplified isolationist narratives that distorted the reasons behind U.S. involvement in the First World War. This understanding is crucial in guarding against the deceptive mindsets that prevailed during the 1930s, post-Vietnam, and resurface today.